Well, good afternoon. Welcome to our podcast. This is not a podcast. This is our webinar. I get so confused. I look at it and I think it's our webinar. And so we're glad to be able to record this. Uh, to start off with, I just wanted to give a shout out to everybody who gave us some feedback. We really, really appreciated it. We heard some good things. People really liked the discussion around the 2x10 model. Um, People really liked the stories. There was a lot of interest in the three different perspectives. I don't know if some of the perspectives are more different than others, but I'll leave that with you. And they really, really liked videos. One suggestion I thought was interesting was when you're talking about leadership, how about talking about situations where things don't succeed as well as you'd hoped, and how did that change your practice, which I think would be a great topic for a series of podcasts or even webinars. So with that, let's get started with some practical strategies for building relationships. Steve.
Well, it's interesting. So I went back to my cache of stories, and I'm trying to think of one that, sort of when I first started out, because, as principals and vice principals, we all start out somewhere. We get into the job and we're fairly new at it, and we think we know what we're doing, but we definitely don't. And it was my first year as a vice principal, which was, an interesting time, because back then in the 1990s, I was also half-time teaching. And I'm sure that it applies to a lot of school boards across the country, but in my board, it doesn't anymore. But back then we did. So I was teaching half-time and vice principal half-time. And my principal, so here I am feeling my way through this job half-time. And in January, my principal went off on a leave for 9 weeks. It was a medical leave that was supposed to last a couple of days and then a week and then extended. And so I said, sure, I can fill in. And I got a supply teacher to cover my part of the teaching. And so I'm sort of feeling my way along, basically in charge of the school after being a vice principal for 4 months. And every week it got extended and it got extended. And so now I'm into doing things like staffing. I had to relocate a classroom because of asbestos. All these things going on that I called it trial by fire, because it
They didn't
really
teach you that
literally
stuff in
was.
the course.
Pardon me?
They didn't teach that stuff in the
No,
course about
it never came up. It's
no
funny, it never came up. I
classrooms and asbestos and
went back and flipped through my notes. What to do when you're suddenly in charge of a school.
Right.
And the sticky point came, I had a really tough staff issue. And without going into detail what it was, not sure how to proceed. I called my superintendent and chatted a bit and said, here's what's going on, try to get some feedback, and, how should I proceed? Because I didn't want to step on any union toes and stuff like that. And it all went well. But then about a day later, I got a call from a principal at a neighboring school who'd been a principal for quite a bit of time. And I'd known him, so he felt he could call me and give me some advice as an experienced principal. He's going to give me some advice as a new VP in charge. He said, absolutely never call your superintendent if you need help. Call one of us, but never call your superintendent, because you're basically telling them you don't know what you're doing. I said, but I don't know what I'm doing. And said, no. And if you want to become a principal, you have to make decisions on your own. You have to think on your feet, be quick, decisive. And he went through this whole list of basically how to be an authoritarian principal. Quick, decisive, unilateral decision making. Don't ask for help, because you're just telling people you don't know what you're doing. He said, better to make a decision and have it go bad than to ask for help. I was thinking to myself, okay, I hadn't been a vice principal very long, but I had been a leader in other situations and in many other situations. And it just didn't ring true to me that that was the way to proceed. And this is long before I'd heard of what restorative practices were, or the 4 quadrants, or any of that kind of stuff. But it still didn't ring true to me that that should be how we should work doing this job, that sometimes it would be okay to ask for other people's advice. And I had a few other principals who I had worked for. They had been my principal, and I felt comfortable calling them, and they were quite happy to help. They didn't really agree with this other fellow, and I didn't agree with him either. And so that was my first introduction to being a vice principal, getting advice from a lot of people, but also getting some very bad advice, I thought, how to be an authoritarian principal, when at that time, that was kind of the norm. That was what was expected of principals. You were in charge of your school. You did your own thing. You didn't ask for help. You went ahead, made decisions, and if it went flat, well, you dealt with that too. That's just how it was. Well, so that was my trial by fire. You're in charge of the school, and you know, a week went to 9 weeks before they finally realized that this principal wasn't coming back, and then brought a new principal in to take her spot. So you learn by doing, but you should also learn by asking. And it's just not all one, it's not all the other. And sometimes you make mistakes, but I always thought, you know, what I learned from that was ask for help, work with people, tell people, look, I'm new at this. I'm not quite sure how to proceed. I'm going to try and get some help. I'll get back to you. I'm not going to make a quick decision just to show that I'm decisive. I'll make a good decision after talking to some people and hopefully getting some advice. So you learn those things as you go.
And also you said learn from your mistakes, right? Which is classic. We ask kids to
Yes.
learn from their mistakes and give them the
Exactly.
messaging that that's okay to do. It's the same for us. I mean, I used to say to my children who are now adults, well, that didn't go very well. What are we going to do next time? Right. So then you start to think that through, because you're going to be faced with something similar at some point. So what lessons have you taken away from it? And I still do it to this day if something doesn't go quite the way I'd hoped it would go. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, leadership is a lot of making mistakes. And as you say, we've all made mistakes. And when I reflect on the mistakes I made as a leader, quite often a lot of it had to do with communication or lack of communication, or the way I chose to communicate, thinking that was going to be okay and that would work. And then things just fell apart, and you go, gee, you go back and you reflect and go, well, I guess communicating in that way, sending emails or posting a letter on a door or whatever that was, just wasn't the best way to communicate in that situation. So you learn from it. You go, well, next time I'm going to do this. I'll try it this way. I'll see if that works. Especially true when you're communicating with parents. We all say, well, there's a newsletter went home. How come you didn't know? Well, we know that a lot of kids don't take the newsletter. Back in the old days, we would print hard copies and every kid got a copy. A lot of them didn't take it home. So then to say to a parent, well, there was a newsletter, so you should have known.
On the first of the month, and now
Yeah,
it's the 16th.
it wasn't really a great response, because we know that a lot of kids don't take those things home. So you have to think of what's a better way to communicate. And, those are the mistakes you learn as you go. You learn from when things go flat.
All right. So are we ready to get into the conversation then? All right. Sorry, I just had this up and now it's gone. So that's what we're going to talk about today, is some practical strategies, because that's often what we get asked for. What are the things that I can walk away with today and apply tomorrow, or think about integrating into my practice? So what can I do to build relationships? And it sounds very easy, and it can be these are generally easy strategies, but we have to be thoughtful about it and intentional. And you'll hear that word come up a lot. So as Steve already referred to, is how do I communicate, and how does that affect my relationships around me, whether that's coworkers, parents, staff that I'm supervising, kind of the support group around me. How does that affect those relationships? And then we're going to talk about how to clarify your role by having courageous conversations. So talking with your boss and not to your boss, or be on the receiving end of a conversation with your boss. Anything you guys want to add there?
No,
I think it's important to I think it's important that everybody recognizes that yes, we have to communicate. It's the how-to that I think restorative practice will help us with. Mm-hmm. Sorry, Steve, you were going to jump in.
I was going to touch on the courageous conversations. And when you're talking with your boss, sometimes it's about, you just sit there and you listen. And that's not really a conversation. That's a dialogue, one-sided dialogue. So
I would call those monologues, Steve.
Monologues, exactly. Yes, just tell me, yes, and you nod your head. I'll never do it again. But what we want to talk about is how to have that conversation with your boss. And I call them courageous conversations, because sometimes they're difficult topics, and sometimes it's gonna, you may walk out of the room not happy, or someone may not be happy, because the topics can be very dicey sometimes, especially when you're talking with your superintendent or your boss and you don't agree with them, or they've asked you to do something and you don't agree with it. How do you have a conversation around that? So we'll go into that. But let's
Right.
talk about how we communicate and how this affects our relationships. So this is a little graphic that I put together a while ago, and I call it restorative communication, but it's communication. Essentially, restorative communication is conveying messages using different forms while embracing the foundational tenets of restorative practices, which are those boxes. So the principles of fair process, recognizing that restorative practice is a social science that helps build social capital, and also that the underlying hypothesis is we work with people. But the principles of fair process, engagement, allowing others to have a say, because communication is a two-way street. And so when we look at the three basic ways we communicate, written, verbal, and nonverbal, how do we work engagement into that? How do we work explanation into that? The fair process. So when I mentioned earlier, we make mistakes, and sometimes the mistakes that stand out for me as a leader usually have to do with communication. It usually is centered around the written piece, because a piece of written communication may not be a very fair way to communicate, because it doesn't allow for that back the communication back, the engagement or the opportunity for others to have a say. And so the written communication is one form. Verbal is obviously the second form, but the biggest form of communication, and to me, the form that really helps us to develop relationships, is the nonverbal, because nonverbal communication is so much a part of how we communicate, and we don't often think about it. We don't often understand just how much other people learn from us simply by watching us, the nonverbal cues. And so we're going to talk about those three forms of communication and how they affect the relationships you have with staff, with students, with parents in the educational community. Anything anybody want to jump in on that?
Yeah, I just want to add around the nonverbal, and it's such a huge piece. And we're not talking about people in crisis today, but if you're trying to communicate with somebody who is very heated about something or very angry, upset, they're only hearing 7% of your words. The rest of it is your nonverbal. So it just shows the power of the nonverbal. And so that's in a kind of a crisis or an angry situation. But even and we'll talk more about nonverbal, but even in a regular conversation, it gives so many other messages than what your words might be saying.
Right.
And I think with technology too, one of the things that happens is people are very quick to write things down and to fire off a text or an email. And one of the things that I ended up learning in leadership was not to respond right away. First of all, to give like a 24-hour cooling down for myself, because often the things that were said in emails were things that would really push some buttons for me. So just emotionally, to just give myself a little bit of time. And then secondly, as much as possible, talk with someone in response to a written concern. So if a parent fires off an email to you, arrange a time to talk, because that allows the parent to see the nonverbal and the verbal, not just what happens in writing. The other thing that happens is when you have something written, like a text or something like that, people receive it in the kind of the emotional space that they're in right now. And so there may be things that you never intended that they pick up out of something that's written. And that's something just to be aware of. I can't tell you how many times after having a conversation with somebody, either I or somebody else will say, "Ooh, like that's not what I meant at all, right? That's not what I intended." So those are just some things to keep in mind as well.
Right. And the other problem, I suppose, with emails and anything, texting and anything on social media is that it's there forever. Yeah. And you fire off an email response in a heated moment. That person that receives it, whether it's a parent or a teacher, whoever, they've got that. And now they're angry. So they're going to forward it to 10 of their closest friends to say, "What do you think of this?" And before you know it, it's out there, it's everywhere, and it's not going away. I always say to teachers, don't email angry. Don't communicate assessments or evaluations by email. Don't talk about a child and don't do it by email, but use the email to arrange a time to have an oral conversation, whether it's over the phone or even in person. So we can email is easy. It's a way to communicate very, very quickly. A lot of people expect an instantaneous response, but I wouldn't respond instantaneously just because somebody thinks that. And no more would I respond instantaneously if they called me on the phone and said, you better call me back in the next 5 minutes because I'm angry. I'll decide, is that an important thing to do, or should I wait a little longer? Is that person angry, or should I wait till the next day? When I'm going to call them back. So it's no different than emailing or reading anything in writing. But letters, notes that I talked earlier about, sending home those monthly newsletters. They were all written and sent home and printed out in hard copy. Now we do them electronically. We might have a school website. We write things and post them on the school website. There's lots of different ways we communicate in writing. But it is important that people read over what you're going to send. I was having a conversation with some people the other day about whenever there's a crisis at a school, we have to send a letter home to parents or send a communication home to parents to explain what had happened that day. And in I remember back in, going back many, many years, something would happen. I'd write up a quick letter and we'd print it out and hand it out to all the kids as they're leaving the door, explaining why, they couldn't go out for recess that day because there was a bear sighting or something like that. Now everything goes through our communication department. You'll have a crisis at school. The first people you talk to is the communication department, and they say, we will craft a communication for you to go home to parents, because that's their expertise. They've taken that out of the hands of administrators now in the boards I worked in, simply because they want that common message. Whether it's a bear sighting or a lockdown or whatever the reason was, they have a bunch of standard letters all made up. And actually, in actual fact, it's a lot quicker. But you just have to let them know the circumstances. Boom, the letter comes out. It gets sent home through the whatever the server, whatever the way you communicate, usually electronically. It's great. But that's how we communicate now, a standard template letter rather than just off the cuff.
Agree. Sorry.
Go
The way
ahead.
to think about the written piece is I came from a different training background than Steve and Stan. And it was always for us is like, don't write anything down that you're not prepared to speak to in court and be questioned on. So it was just, and that's pretty extreme, but it was great to keep in the back of your mind. Is there judgment going into that communication? And am I saying something that I can't support if I was challenged on it? So it's just always in the back of your mind that, what you're writing down could show up somewhere else. Yep.
And the other piece in terms of building relationships with written communications, should I write it down? Is it something I should send out in writing, or is it something I should talk to in person? It's easy to sit in your office as a principal and send off emails to your staff all day. Can you do this? Can you do that? Have you done this? Have you done that? But is that how you want them to perceive you, as somebody who just communicates in written form? Or can you walk down the hall and knock on their door and have a conversation? Hey, let's talk about that assignment, or let's talk about that report you had to have get done. Let's go through that. When I think of the evaluations we have to do with teachers, it has to be in written form. It has to be written on a template. Before I ever even wrote them, I would sit down and talk to the teacher, and we would go through each question, and we would have a conversation about it. So when the written report finally came out, there was nothing in there that was surprising for that person. And so that's the other part of written, is when should you write things down, or when should you just have a conversation, and how does that affect the relationship you have with your staff and with the students and parents? So
if I just reflect on it, I think most of the communication that happens through email and so on in schools, and even some of the, face-to-face communication, is very transactional. I need this from you. I need you to do that. And it really does not focus on the relationship piece. When you have a conversation that starts with, how things are going, and where are you at as an individual, whether that's your boss or a teacher that you're working with or your vice principal, that it starts with the emphasis on the other person first, just about how things are going for them, how the ball tournament or hockey tournament was over the weekend. And only secondly, go to the transactional side of, you know, and I also wanted to talk to you about this because otherwise what starts to happen is every time you see someone at some point in the school, they're going to duck and run because, oh, they want something from me again, or they're going to tell me to do something again, right? So uh, it really becomes, and here's Shelley's word, you know, it becomes very intentional that you want to be able to create a relational atmosphere with the adults that you're working with, and it will carry over to how they're working with students as well.
Right. And the other thing that was about emails, we've gotten into this habit, and of course now it's written down that you can't do it, is the time of day you send emails.
Right.
I mean, it used to be people would send them all night long, and as leaders, you know, you're a principal and you're sending emails to your staff at 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night, you know, 7 o'clock on a Friday night, Saturday morning, they're getting these emails.
I used to learn
And
my principal's
right,
patterns.
right.
They were
And
either
so what is
early
that?
morning or late night.
Right. And what message are you sending to your staff? What is that telling them about you as a leader? Do you expect them to respond? You know, we as teachers, they'd all sit around. Are we supposed to respond to that? Like, this came out Friday night. Are we supposed to wait till Monday morning? Or what are we supposed to do? Do they expect something? And if they do expect it, well, that's not fair. I'm not working on the weekends. And so that guy's just asking too much. And how that's the kind of stuff that affects your relationship with your staff. And, you know, now, of course, it's all written in a lot of legislation that you can't email after certain times of the day. And a lot of school boards have addressed that. We had, for years, we heard the message from, you know, central administration about work-life balance. You have to take care of your work-life balance. And yet they're sending emails out on Sunday mornings. Well, how is that taking care of, you know, you say one thing, but you're not doing it. So what does that say about them as leaders? So we have to really be careful about that, the timing of written communications, as well as what's in them.
Well, we could communicate about this a lot longer, but we better move on just because of time. See what else we've got for you.
Well, this is the nonverbal piece. And as I said before, I think we communicate so much non-verbally that we don't even think about. And so this is all the different forms of nonverbal communication. And so some of them are a little bit, you know, more prevalent than others. Gestures, and when we talk about gestures, you know, our hand gestures when we talk, the things we do with our you know, different fingers and that kind of stuff. And in certain cultures, they mean one thing as opposed to something else. But that whole idea of our gestures, haptics is not something that you probably have heard much before. The perception of objects by touch and proprioception. You know, really, when you put your hand on somebody's shoulder, that's haptics. What is that saying about you as a person? What is that saying about how you're communicating? You don't have to say anything, just to put your hand on somebody's shoulder. That's haptics. Shaking hands is haptics. Proxemics. We talk about proximity. As teachers, we were always told, you know, somebody's kind of acting up. You know, go over and stand next to them. That's proximity. And so proxemics is how we deal with that, those people around us, the effective spatial separation. You know, you don't want to get too close to somebody. You want to give people their physical space. When somebody walks right up to you and stands right in front of you face to face, it makes you very uncomfortable. And if you've ever done that I've done it at workshops where we're told, go stand next to somebody almost nose to nose. No one makes eye contact. They're looking away and they really do feel uncomfortable. So remember about proxemics and your spatial distancing from people and how that may make them feel if you are too close. Facial expressions, I think, is something that's pretty obvious to us. Sometimes we make facial expressions without thinking about it, rolling our eyes or something like that. That certainly conveys a message to somebody. So think about that. Paralinguistics is not something you may have heard of much before, but those are the sounds we make. If you start, you're going, you know, shaking your head and going just those are paralinguistics. And Stan's doing a marvelous job of that. And so when you are listening to somebody and they're talking to you, one thing, of course, is shaking your head or nodding or maintaining eye contact. All those are there as well. But the other thing is how the noises you're making are, as someone is telling you something and you're nodding your head up and down and going, you're showing that you are listening. But if you start, that's showing that you're kind of questioning what they're saying. I'm not really sure what you're saying is very good. So that's paralinguistics. Our body language, as opposed to eye contact or facial expression, our body language, how we stand, whether our arms are crossed, do we look comfortable? Are our hands in our pockets? Do you have that, are you that stance with, feet wide apart, arms crossed, looking authoritarian? As Shelley mentioned earlier about, if somebody is in an agitated state, how we present ourselves to them and our body language may diffuse that, or it may accelerate that. If we look like, if our body language is showing that we're ready to take them on, then they're ready to give it. But if our body language is showing that we're comfortable, we're relaxed, if we can do that in a situation like that, it may relax them as well. Appearances, this is a really tough one, because how you dress, your hairstyle, all those factors that affect appearance convey a message. One of the toughest things, I was doing this workshop not too long ago, we got talking about tattoos. They convey a message. It's an appearance thing. It's popular. People have tattoos. Well, now it's up their neck and around their eyebrows and all the rest. What is that saying about them? What's the message you're conveying? Whether it's fair or not, it's still conveying a message to people. Their hairstyle, the color of their hair, all those things convey messages, and messages can affect relationships. Eye contact, of course, we've talked about eye contact when you're talking to somebody, maintain eye contact, but keep in mind that some cultures that's not acceptable and it may be more of an insult. So know the context of who you're speaking with, but maintaining eye contact in our culture is generally seen to be appropriate. And when someone's talking, especially as a leader, someone comes into your office, whether it's a staff member, whoever, they want to have a conversation with you and you're sitting at your desk and the whole time you're looking down at the paperwork on your table, your desk, and they're talking, but you're not making eye contact. What is that saying about you as a leader? Do you care about what they're saying? You can say, "Oh, I'm listening. I'm just signing these forms." Well, you're not really listening. Your 100% attention is now, 90% on your work and 10% on them. And so, if you want to give somebody 100% attention, make eye contact with them. And the last piece is the interesting one. And it came up a lot doing a lot of Zoom meetings, and that's the artifacts. Those are the things that we have around us that say something about us. And in a Zoom meeting, what are the artifacts? Well, it's all those things that are on the wall behind you. Those are artifacts. And what does that say? What are you communicating? If you've got, you can see behind me, it's kind of a bare wall, and there's one picture off to the side. Everybody's got different things. What if I had a Confederate flag behind me and it was on my wall? What would that say about me? I'm not even going to I'm not going to talk about it, but it's an artifact that people would see and make a conclusion about me. And that would affect relationships. Certainly, it would convey a strong message to some people. So think about what's in your office as a leader. What's on your walls? I never put my degrees up. Some people do that. Some administrators have all their diplomas and degrees and everything on the wall behind them. So whoever's sitting and talking to them as they sit behind their desk, they're looking at all these degrees and diplomas and going, "Oh, wow, this person's done a lot." Is that a way to intimidate people? I don't know. Maybe some people may perceive it that way. I don't even sit behind my desk when I'm having a conversation with people. I come out from around the desk, and we can talk about that later too. But all this is nonverbal. Non-verbally is communicating something about you to another person, and that may affect the relationship you have with that person.
I think
So key
one
about
of the
this, and we're going to talk, give you an opportunity to do this on your own, is that we all do all these things, but the key is being aware of what you do and how that affects. For me, when I think about eye contact, I can keep eye contact, but if I'm getting into a really kind of deep conversation and starting to ponder things, I will look off. It's almost like, or I'm recalling something. So I'm running a movie through my head and I look off to the side, and I've actually had people turn around to see what I'm looking at behind them. But now I know I do that. So when I realize I'm doing that, and I'm starting to get that reaction from them, I address that. And that it's because I'm now in deep thought about what they're asking me about. It's not because I think there's something more interesting back there. So the key is to be aware of these things, and then either be able to change it, monitor it, and or address it if need be.
And for me, it's facial expressions. I think you can read a lot of what I'm thinking with facial expressions, and I've gotten myself into many stressful situations because I didn't control or wasn't aware of what my face was communicating while I was trying to even just to listen to someone.
Yeah, I can do it professionally, but I've been told in my, personal life, like if anybody had been looking at your face, sort of thing. But professionally, I seem to be able to keep that where it needs to
Yeah,
be. Right.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, this is a quote, and I'm not sure where this quote came from, I'll be honest, but I saw this written down. Many principals respond to highly stressful emotional situations in ways that jeopardize their ability to develop and sustain healthy relationships, lead effectively, and build strong ties with the community and support a healthy school. If we think of that first part, respond to highly stressful emotional situations in ways that jeopardize their ability to develop relationships. Think of a stressful situation and how you hope to respond versus how you've seen others respond. And if you're trying to build relationships with the community, and I think of a time we had a first day of school, of course, and a student went missing. A grade 1 student went missing who's supposed to be on the bus, didn't get out to the bus, decided to walk home instead. Parent came in, where's my son? The parent was absolutely agitated. I'll say that is a nice word. Running around the school looking for his son, yelling at teachers for not doing their job, just over the top, full amygdala hijack, as they call it. As a leader, what can you do in that situation to show all the rest of your staff that A, you're supporting them, but B, you're trying to find this kid? And how do you have that conversation with that parent? How do you show them that you are trying to work with them to find their son when all they're doing is yelling and blaming and swearing and all the rest? And so how you respond to that situation will tell everybody else how maybe they can respond. If you run and hide in your office and, oh, geez, that guy's yelling and swearing at people, I'm going to go sit in my office and tell him I'm busy. What does that say about you as a leader? Let the secretaries deal with him. That's not, you're not helping them very much. And that's developing a bit of a relationship problem for you. So you have to respond. You have to take the lead in those situations. How you do that is the hard part. And sometimes it happens so quickly, you haven't really had a chance to think about how would I respond in that situation. And I had that, and I dealt with that. And, the parent wasn't happy with me. He wasn't happy with the school. You let them vent, you let them do what you want. But at the same time, you're trying to ask questions. Well, would he have walked home? Do you think he would have walked home? And hopefully it gets them to slow down and think, well, yeah, maybe he did. I think, and finally the parent realized, well, maybe at this point he walked home. I'm going to drive home, and sped out of the parking lot, went home, and there's his son sitting at home. He'd walked home. And so he felt better that he'd found his son. The child was safe. Everybody was happy the child was safe. But then, of course, as the parent had a chance to calm down, came in the next day. And now we can sit and talk about, well, let's talk about first what happened and how it happened and how it's going to make sure it's not going to happen again. But let's talk about how the situation was dealt with. And this parent was very apologetic for his behavior and apologized to just about everybody he'd sworn at, which is most of my staff, including me. So, at the time, that's not the time to say to somebody who's agitated, you need to calm down. You need to stop swearing. You need to stop what you're doing. Don't use that language in our building or you're going to have to leave. Boy, that's a way to escalate. Maybe you think you're supporting your staff by taking this person head on, saying, don't you swear at my staff. But how is that going to calm him down? It would only make it worse. So you can have that conversation later. But those are the kind of things that you learn as you go. Hopefully not too many times, but they will always happen to any leader, that you're going to have those stressful situations. Children missing is probably one of the most stressful you're going to get, because there is so much that could possibly be, and people's thoughts immediately go to the worst rather than the logical. And so missing children is really a tough one. Fire drills and stranger danger kind of things will all become stressful. Power outages is a situation that's stressful, but something you can manage because it's more of a technical solution rather than an emotional solution. So you can manage yourself in those situations, I think, a little better. But yeah, missing children is the toughest.
I have a question for Shelley. Okay,
Yes.
Shelley, how would you address like naming or labeling the emotion in a situation like that, and how helpful is it or not?
In that moment that Steve described with the frantic parent in panic mode, I don't think it's helpful to name what they're experiencing, other than to say, you don't want to say, I understand your stress, because you may not understand that stress. So I can see that this is extremely stressful, or this is, and we want to help you. But getting into, as Steve said, trying to rationalize at that point is of no use. Somebody's just so escalated that it's like, it's more about letting them know that you're aware of what needs to happen, and actioning that, right? Rather, and then having conversations after, exactly the way Steve described. If we're just trying to shut it down, and if you don't stop that behavior, we're calling the police, all that sort of stuff, you have a whole different issue to now deal with after the child's been located, as opposed to now you've built some ties. This father's going to be pleased with the way it was managed and how he was responded to, and that goes out into the school community as well.
Yeah.
So letting them know that you're aware of the seriousness of what's happening is one thing, but not trying to talk it away in that moment.
And I would suggest too that if you don't know something, that you simply state that as well, rather than try and BS your way through something,
No.
and give an answer to sort of placate someone, but also acknowledge that, like you said, you're working to help as much as possible.
Right. All right, let's move along here. So this is what we said at the beginning. We want to support you with being able to have a dialogue with your boss, rather than just being talked at or delivering messages.
And this can be difficult, and I always found the best way to have these dialogues, and the word dialogue is in quotes, because dialogue implies a two-way conversation, as opposed to just having a conversation. A dialogue is more has more purpose to it. It's more intentional. There's something I'm going into. I can have a conversation with my superintendent. How's the weather? What's the vacation? That's a conversation to me. A dialogue is, I've got a specific topic I want to talk to you about, and we need to talk about it. I've often found it's better to have those in person than over the phone. But sometimes you can't. Sometimes it has to be over the phone, and that's okay too. But certainly you don't have a dialogue by emails and written communication. You have a dialogue through a conversation, through talking. And so the hard part sometimes is introducing what is the purpose of this conversation, this dialogue. You as a school principal or as a vice principal need to talk to your supervisor, whether as a VP, it could be your principal, as a principal, it could be your superintendent or whoever, about a particular topic. And how do you start that conversation? How do you delve into that? How do you physically sit and have that conversation? Are they behind their desk and you're sitting in front of their desk? Are you sitting across from each other at a round table? Are you sitting in comfy chairs in a lounge or in the library or someplace like that? That's something else you need to think about when having that dialogue. How are we going to have this? Are they going to come to you, or am I going to go to them? If the superintendent says, hey, I can't get out of the office, well, can I come to you? Okay. But maybe they drop in. So all those things will help you have that dialogue, whether it's on their turf or your turf. So when I think of teachers who have an issue, want to speak to the principal about it, they generally come to the office. But sometimes they'll say, can you come down to my room? I want to talk to you about whatever. It's all down you go, because now you're on their turf and they feel more comfortable there. They feel better at bringing up a topic that may be a difficult one and maybe a very courageous conversation. So have it on their turf, and that's fine. If it makes them comfortable.
I call that a home field advantage.
The home field advantage. Yeah.
Give the home field advantage to whoever you're talking to, if it's your
Yeah.
boss or a staff member or somebody that you're supervising.
Yeah. Where would you like to meet? The other piece about this is that it's the work long before you have to have those dialogues or those tougher conversations. This is where the relationship part comes in. I've had lots of tough conversations in my role. I had superintendents, I had directors, I had principals, I had many people, community members that I had to have difficult conversations with or wanted to have a dialogue with. But prior to that tough conversation, most of their time, there's been a chance to connect as people, so that we already have an understanding of where we work from and have shown what style we have, etc. But now we're going to have a conversation. So there's a common respect already before we're going into that conversation. So doing that work, and it can't always be, but being mindful of that and intentional that you are going to, if it's somebody they're going to come in contact regularly or in a supervisory position, that you do take the time to connect with them. I've heard working in school, I was a child and youth counselor. I've had people say to me, "But why do you go to the staff meeting?" But for me as a professional, although only a piece of that might have been relevant to me, as a professional, I'm still with this group. So it's how you show up as well. So then now when I have to have a tougher conversation, I understand the bigger picture of things as well.
So I had a situation where I was chairing a board-wide committee that my boss, the superintendent, was a member of, and I had been chairing this committee for a couple of years. And at this one particular meeting, I don't know how to describe it other than that my boss, who was a member of this committee as well, was just a pain in the neck. It was like at every single step, he would undermine what was being said. Rather than having a conversation, which we would normally do, he would simply say, "No, we're doing this." And it was just one of the most frustrating meetings that I've ever experienced. And I was livid. I mean, I can do a pretty decent job of chairing a meeting, and I had been doing it. And this was just terrible. What I did was I did not say anything that day.
No.
I took some time to think about it, but the next day I made a point of making sure I knew when he was going to be in his office. And when he was in his office, I walked by at a time when he wasn't on the phone, and I actually introduced the topic and the conversation, something like this. Say, I wanted to just talk to you about the meeting that we had yesterday. It really seemed to me like it went differently than it normally does. And I just wanted to know what happened from your perspective. What resulted from that was him explaining and actually just falling over himself, apologizing for his behavior. Here's what else was going on. He was under a lot of pressure from his boss, the director, and things were not going well. And it just helped me to just to remember that my boss is a person too who has a supervisor who was also putting all kinds of pressure on him. What resulted from that was we ended up having a really, really good conversation about the meetings, about how we were working together, and we actually the conflict that we had actually brought us closer together in terms of being able to work very well together. So, just a very practical example of sometimes we do need to, confront our boss or tell our boss or talk with our boss about something that's gone on, maybe about a decision that they've made or something they've said, or in this case, the way they participated in a meeting.
All right, so let's move on. So that brings us to courageous conversations, because that's almost what we were talking about there, that those kind of dialogues can feel very much like they're courageous conversations. Steve, you want to pick that up there?
Yeah, probably the toughest conversations I've had, and we, as educators, we often think of how do we can have that conversation with those parents about their children and how they're doing. Honestly, those conversations, while sometimes tough, were not the toughest I've ever had. The hardest conversations, the most courageous conversations, where we're challenging someone's work, or we're trying to listen and get some feedback to improve practice, is usually with teachers. And we do evaluations, formal evaluations, on a routine basis as administrators, but it's the ones in between that are sometimes tough. The formal ones, everybody understands there's an agreed set of rules and there's a template and we follow it, and it's usually it's okay, and there's always a few things to talk about that maybe could lead to improvements. But it's having those conversations as an administrator with a staff member when you've witnessed or seen something that just doesn't feel right. And it's whether that's something they've taught or something they've said as a student or some action you've seen them do, and you think, I can't let that go. I'm going to have a conversation with them about it. How do you have that conversation, as this says, so that you can foster improvement and growth in that conversation? It's not about, hey, I saw you do this, you're in trouble, don't ever do it again, or I'll write you up and put a letter in your file. It's about, how can we have that conversation so that we can improve things? We can make changes so that this is going to get better. And those are the most difficult conversations. They're the most courageous. I think from a teacher standpoint, going the other way, talking to your administrator, it's those communication things that may have gone wrong. And they've said, geez, he sent this memo out, and what are we supposed to do? None of us want to do that. Who's going to go and talk to him and say, hey, none of us want to do that? And those things sometimes happen. Usually it's, you send a memo out saying, here's what needs to be done. And usually it's your union rep that comes back and says, hey, you can't tell us to do that, kind of thing. They feel very emboldened, and they love the opportunity to come in and say, you can't make us do that. But it's a lot of staff, I just don't feel comfortable doing that. But who's going to go and talk to the principal? Sometimes those conversations are easier had if you've already developed very positive relationships in the first place. And they also get a whole lot easier after you've established yourself within a school. Over time, people say, oh, yeah, you can go talk to him about that. He's great with that. Or she always listens. She always comes up with a solution with you. Go ahead and have those conversations. Don't be afraid to tell. So other staff will say, hey, I had an issue with that. I spoke to her. She was great. Go ahead, have that conversation. So those things get easier. But courageous conversations, challenging people so that they can improve, that's a tough thing to do. And how do you weigh into that? We'll go back to Stan's home field advantage thing. If I have to speak to a staff member because I've seen something that just doesn't feel right, I'll probably go down to their room. I'll give them the advantage of the homeroom to make them feel a little more comfortable. But by the same token, here's what I saw. Let's talk about that. And not, why did you do it? Let's go back to our restorative communication. But tell me what happened when I saw this happen. What was going on in the classroom? I heard you yelling at the students. Don't ever yell at the students again, versus I heard some raised voices. Tell me what was happening. And you'll get a whole different response. And now it's a restorative conversation, not an authoritarian conversation.
At
I
this
heard
point in
one of
our
our
careers, we have all experienced different supervisors, from whether you're working at Dairy Queen as a 14-year-old to where you are now. So if you think about what style or what kind of phrases or what approach was helpful to you to come up with solutions or change behaviors, you're going to be able to come up with a list that is helpful to most people. So just being, again, reflective on what's helpful for you if somebody had to approach you on a tough situation, and what would you like to hear from that person, and then being able to deliver some of that yourself, is another way to kind of gauge or script yourself to have those conversations with people.
Do you remember the podcast guest that we had a number of weeks ago who had to have a challenging conversation with a teacher about hand washing? And she sort of set the stage. And what I really liked about the way she did it, she set the stage this way, something along the lines of, like, when I see you doing your work in the classroom, you're doing really, really excellent work with this and that, but this doesn't seem to fit. Can you tell me what's happening with that? Right. So you've basically said something isn't fitting. Like, for example, using Steve's example of, generally when I come past the classroom, your voice is very, very controlled. And I noticed that today you raised your voice, and there was kind of how that can kind of encourage people to talk about it without feeling blamed. Or, I mean, you do have to bring it up, but setting a bit of a context. Look, give people the home field advantage. And actually, I would add, even setting a time that works. Is after school, before school, during a break? What time works? We do need to talk about it.
Right. So hopefully there's a few tips there for you. We've kind of addressed some of them, about how to enter in. We've talked about some of these points already. Anything anybody wants to add there?
Well,
How do we know if they've been successful? I guess if you see some change that you've been hoping for, or a problem being solved, or a new direction, or that the relationship is still intact, I would say it's been successful. You may not have agreed in the end, but we still have an intact relationship.
right. I go to the bottom part about how can we create the conditions for positive, courageous conversations. And that I mentioned or talked about earlier is, where do you have that conversation, and what's the setting? And you know, if I always use as an example of that authoritarian piece. I'm sitting behind my desk and you're sitting a chair in front of me. I'm in charge because I've got the big desk. And quite often you'll see that person sitting higher up than the person opposite them. So they're kind of looking up at you. That's not really creating those creative conditions for a positive conversation. There'll be a conversation there. There'll be a dialogue, but I doubt it'll be very positive. And so think of sitting opposite each other in chairs or across a table so that you're both same level, eye to eye, those kind of things. Those kind of help create better conditions for a positive conversation. And as Stan just said, at the time of the day, if you walk into a teacher's classroom at the end of the day and say, look, we need to talk about what happened, and you can see them getting agitated, but it looks like now isn't a good time. Or is now a good time, giving them the option of when, because the time is also a condition as well. So, those things are so important to have those courageous conversations. Think of, be intentional and plan the location. We certainly don't do it in the hallway where people are walking by and other teachers may listen. That's not appropriate either. So, and you want to do it in a private spot, but it could be the office, it could be their classroom, it could be the staff room, some kind of a neutral place even. So think about that.
There's a
I
reason
think
why
too.
often in my work, with my meetings and having some really tough conversations with families, we're in their own homes. Or if that wasn't comfortable for them, it was at Tim Hortons. It wasn't in the school building, which may not have been a comfortable place for them. So that's the same sort of thing, where maybe they were very comfortable coming in the school. That's great. We'll do it here. But checking in with them, time of day, so you're not asking them to miss work or those kind of things. It's the same. It's respectful as well. So it is key to create those conditions as much as possible.
And I think
But
it's
we have to
important.
have the conversation, but how are we going to do it?
And I think it's important too to remember that the presenting issue may not, in fact, be the real issue. You may think that this is what is going on when there's something entirely, different that's happening. So be open to the possibility that things are not the way they appear to you, and listen to find out and clue into the emotion, some of the other information that you can get from someone when you're having these conversations as well.
Right.
Be curious, right?
And that's why you go in with that curiosity of tell me what's happening or what's been happening, as opposed to, I heard you yelling and that has to stop, or else, I'm putting a letter in your file. And I say that tongue in cheek, but I had a colleague, an administrator many years ago. That was her approach to any staff, misstep, was they're getting a letter in their file, and she'd write up a letter
and deal with things, but it doesn't change behaviors, right?
Well, that's the old written versus oral, but also it was her way of controlling and being punitive to her staff if they weren't doing things. A letter went in their file, because it's, a lot of staff, a letter in my file, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm going to get fired? Like, it's a very scary thing. And that was her threat. If you don't, you don't do that, or else you're getting a letter in your file. And she would put the letters in the file.
A lot of transfers and movement in her school.
Well, she did, but she also had a lot of people that weren't very cooperative in terms of when she needed something done. Why would I work for you? So, as Stan said, there may be something else totally going on. A teacher yelling at a student is usually a symptom of something else going on. Either the student's been a real pill all that day, or the staff member is struggling with something. There could be a whole backstory behind all that you aren't aware of. And then to go in and then say, don't do it again or you're in trouble. How is that helping them? But let's have a conversation. Sit down in those nice comfy chairs. Tell me what's going on. They may open up to you. They may not. They may just simply say, look, I got some things I'm dealing with at home and I'm a little stressed out today. Sorry, it won't happen again. But they may want to go into some detail about what's going on at home and what's caused that stress. And you know what? That's fine too. Go with it.
All right.
I'm just going to call time here. What else do we need to make sure that we include before we wrap this up? We've got 3 minutes.
Yeah.
What do you want to put? What do you want to put in your minute, Shelley? And what do you want to put in your minute,
I was
Steve?
thinking, we always want to share stories. And when I was thinking about using the restorative framework or restorative practices in action as a person who, although I've been in leadership positions, when I was in a school, I was not the leader, but I was a team member. And the story that came to mind was an administrator who both used fair process and a very restorative mindset. As my role in child and youth worker, a student was in a fight and he was having to make some decisions around discipline. And he called me into his office, understanding my role, and we had an existing relationship, and he saw me as a team member to understand and to ask me what I thought would be best support for this student, understanding that suspension on its own is not going to change this child's behavior. So he had me come in and he asked me my thoughts on this, which would be probably far as I could get from suspension, but that was still valuable information for him to have. So the fair process was that I felt valued with my word for him. I felt valued as a team member, but I also understood that he had to take other factors into account. And my opinion or my thoughts were only one piece of that for him. So that, but it added to the restorative piece for him. Yes, the suspension had to happen, but then, we're going to do this to bring the child back in. We're going to have him do this to understand, do the restorative work to understand the impact of his behavior. So it can integrate in lots of ways. It's not just cookie cutter. Anyway, that's the story that came to mind to kind of encompass the restorative framework for me.
And what were 3 helpful questions that we can use?
Well, when you're having courageous conversations, I think that, tell me what's happening.
Yeah.
I think that's the obvious one, not why did you do this, but tell me what's happening. But if it's if you're working with staff to try to improve practices or whatnot, what can I do to help? It's a very simple question. What do you need? What can I do to help? That says a lot about you as a leader when you're trying to get improvement. Not you better clean up your act and you better do it better next time, but how can I help you be better next time? Is there something I can do to help you? That's only 2 questions. I'm struggling.
The other one I would add would be, so what are our next steps after we've had the conversation, right? So that we both know where we're moving from here.
When I often would add a question, if you're having a courageous conversation and it gets stalled, it doesn't seem to be going anywhere, rather than saying, what do you need? I actually ask, so what do you need right now?
Mm.
And sometimes the answer I'll get is, I need you to stop asking me questions. Fine.
Yeah.
I need you to stop talking. Okay.
Well,
all right. I need to pick this up again. I need some time to whatever. But to ask right now, what do you need right now? I found very helpful.
That reminds me of a very humorous story, which probably doesn't apply, but it was a student who was having a really rough day, and a child and youth worker who was trying to help, who kept, and when we talk about nonverbal, the proxemics weren't there. She kept approaching the student too closely, and that got the student even angry. But she just kept saying, how can I help you? How can I help you? And the student would say, you can help me by just effing off. And then she would repeat it, but okay, but how can I help you? You can F off. And this went on, like on and on and on. And so the next day when I was talking to the child and youth worker, he says, I just didn't seem to be able to reach her. And I said, well, I think you reached her. I think she was telling you what she wanted. You just weren't reacting to it. And she says, what do you mean? I said, I think you should have just effed off. I said, just walk away and leave her. It was obvious she didn't want to talk to you. Just leave her. But you kept asking her and asking her and asking her. So sometimes it's not about the questions we ask. It's maybe the questions that we just don't ask. Just when you realize that you're not getting anywhere, stop asking the question. But it reminds me of that situation because, we can ask, how can we help somebody? But it's also what state are they in when we ask those questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. So Stan, anything you want to add there?
All right. Well, we do want to hear from you, and I'm going to be, yeah, sure. Um, uh, I really appreciate that we had this time to talk through all of these questions. What I'm going to do is to put a survey link, just a feedback link for you that goes with your access to the recording. And the nice thing about seeing this as a recording rather than live is you can do what my adult kids do. They watch it at 1.5 or 2 times the speed. So this 1 hour webinar you could get through in 30 minutes easily. So really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this and to also engage with us. So thanks very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.